First, my name is Rob Longiaru. Yes, I do work for the Town of Hempstead Department of Conservation and Waterways as a conservation biologist. I'm here to speak today as a researcher, as a conservationist, as a citizen, not so much a conservation biologist. I have 40 hours a week to deal with that stuff. While some of that work was done through that position, a lot of the research and the outreach that I've done afterwards has been on my own time, collaborating with different groups and researchers to just better the work that we did here at the town. I want to give special mention to a few people who are important and vital to this research and making it all happen. First and foremost, Dr. Catherine Goodenough, who was our primary focused researcher when we first got into this research about 5, 6 years ago. She at the time was working at the University of Oklahoma on her PhD, and since then has moved on to various other programs, but was the #1 researcher in terms of movement ecology, and especially with black skimmers. Also, I want to give special mention to Tara Schneider-Moran, Kathleen Robb, Chris Smith, John Zarutsky, and all the other Town of Hempstead staff who were vital in the field work component of this research. Here are some other organizations, not only funding partners like the National Science Foundation, Nassau County Soil and Water Conservation District, Oklahoma Biological Society, and Laird Research were major funding partners for not only transmitters, but staff and equipment and other sorts. Project partners included different Audubon groups, chapters, not only local ones, but ones across the Flyway who have helped us with resites across the years. Audubon New York, New York State DEC have provided staff as you can see here, for different banding projects and other projects. So let's get into the research. Let's get into kind of why we got here, why we wanted to look at black skimmers especially. I think black skimmers, which we'll get into, are extremely unique species. So overall, coastal ecosystems are dynamic, complex, fragile, but they're capable of resiliency. So we wanted to look at some of these, test some of these theories using a shorebird like black skimmer. So some of our research and conservation goals included advanced collaborative studies that pioneer movement and research with a focus on coastal species conservation and management to further improve adaptive management strategies for species of concern. That's a whole bunch of jargon, but really what we're trying to do is connect coastal species conservation and adaptive management. And adaptive management are really using new technologies, new ways, and thinking outside the box on how to manage these species, because by 2050, half of the world's population will be located within 50 miles of a global coastline. And that is really serious. Us who live here on Long Island know that space is limited, and that's not only for people, that goes for the birds, the mammals, and every insect and plant species that is supposed to reside here on Long Island. And understanding how species will adapt to anthropogenic influenced climate change is one of the greatest challenges for ecologists and evolutionary biologists today. Not only to study, because it's so complex, it's so broad, there are so many variables, so it's very hard to create a case for the public to fully connect with how these systems are working. We know the ecosystem as a whole is incredibly dynamic, and how do we connect those things using specific markers? And in this case, again, is a black skimmer. So why would we use scientific technology to add to the management? So there's only certain things that we can do as humans with just our eyes and ears to understand these species. So all of our predecessors who researched these species for a very long time, only had certain tools, and a lot of them were just their eyes and their ears to understand these species. So the use of technology like GPS telemetry, camera traps, and also molecular studies such as genetics, stable isotopes, and other things that we'll get into really can help guide conservation instead of the same old, same old. So a term I heard recently from the BBL, the bird banding lab, was gone are the days of bling it and fling it. You can't just, we're not just here to band a bird and let it go, because we're at the point where we want to learn more. So our research really got into a lot of that. So here in New York, I'm speaking to a crowd that likely knows what a black skimmer is, but we're going to go through it anyway because I think they're an incredibly unique species They're one of my favorites, and many people don't know that there are three subspecies, which we're not going to get into today, but there are species across the West Coast and Central America that are genetically different than the ones we see here on the Atlantic coast. So they are colonial ground nesting species similar to terns and gulls that we see across the area. Their breeding site fidelity, which is their need to go back to their original nesting site, is very strong. Very similar to terns and plovers that we see. They like to nest in the same areas. Even a Canada goose, they like to nest in the same areas. Many birds have very, very strong site fidelity. Black skimmer are no different. They have a unique foraging ecology. I think that's what makes them the most unique. As you can see on the photo above, they have a large lower mandible, much larger than their top mandible, which allows them to skim for food along the top of the water surface, which is obviously unique to really only them. They have sexual size dimorphism. The males are much, much larger than the females, which I didn't know going into this. So it was great to obviously find that out, which obviously contributes to their life history as well. Here in New York, they're here from May through about October, depending on the season. And the largest nesting colony is here in Lido Beach at Nickerson Beach. And I'm sure many of you here tonight have been there, and maybe that's where you've met me, etc. But we'll get into why that's an issue in a little bit. Black skimmer management in New York State broadly, not only in the town where we're obviously managing the colony that's there, but there are other colonies across New York, obviously all on Long Island. They are listed as special concern in New York. There's been proposed increased listing to threatened. So there has been comment periods for that for many years. It still hasn't changed. But again, the biggest concern with black skimmer in New York are not their numbers of individuals or number of pairs or their productivity, it's the number of colonies. So the Long Island Colonial Waterbird Survey is a historical baseline data set. It's a survey that I participate in every year and have for many years. And Black Skimmer are part of that survey. So that serves as our baseline data set as to what's going on Long Island for Black Skimmer in New York. So as you can see from the graph at the bottom, the number of sites, active sites where there's active skimmer breeding found during this colonial waterbird survey, which happens in June every year. That number drastically declined from 2009 through 2010 for the reasons I can't tell you, but that number dropped in half. And since then, the Nickerson colony has been the major source of skimmer in New York, which is why I said, why is that a problem? So as the number of skimmer go up, the number of skimmer in New York also go up. So the slice of pie that the Nickerson holds is larger than it's ever been, as opposed to prior to 2008. Prior to 2009, the Nickerson colony held less than 50% of all the skimmers. Now we hold over 80% of the skimmer that are nesting here in New York. So that puts a lot of pressure on one colony. So if there is a high level of disturbance, disease, weather, management change, all of these things are possible contributors to the downfall of not only one colony, but the entire New York population of black skimmer. So that's why there was a strong focus in the research on the Nickerson colony at first. We've obviously collaborated with other colonies. Breezy Point is one. Fish and Wildlife manages that. Arvor by the Sea is managed by New York City Parks. Democrat Point is managed by New York State Parks, and they all have nesting skimmer, and we collaborate during the summer months and understand, what birds are moving where. Hempstead Bay Estuary, all of us are probably local, so we're familiar with our waterway. Nickerson Beach is down on the Barrier Island, on Long Beach Island, on the west side of Jones Inlet, at Nickerson Beach at Lido. So why is the estuary important? Again, that was the primary focus of our research, at least locally. So, like I said, tracking local movements during the breeding season and characterizing diet is our focus for our local interest. So how do the skimmer that are nesting here, why do they nest at Nickerson Beach? Why do they nest only at Nickerson Beach? And why are they utilizing the food source nearby Nickerson Beach. So if you've ever been there before, it's a very large beach. There's actually a very long walk to the water from where you'd enter the beach, but it's still a very highly recreated beach that's managed for recreation. There are areas, of course, where these skimmer nest that are protected for them and all. But why do they nest at Nickerson Beach? Why do they put up with the pressures and the people and all the disturbance that happens at this site? So tracking local movements was very important to this research, and which where it really started. Um, Dr. Goodenough was very interested in the long scale movements. So where do they go after they breed, and how do they interact during the non-breeding season, and how does that connect to their breeding outlook? So are they doing poorly in the wintering grounds, which is affecting their summer nesting? And methods that we used was GPS telemetry, chick provisioning surveys, actually looking at their diets, and then stable isotope modeling, which again is looking at diet through a molecular analysis. Foraging objectives and for the skimmer, again, included telemetry movements, isotope modeling, and statistical analysis. One of the priorities for greater protection of this species is to understand the relationship between foraging, ecology, habitat availability, and impacts to reproductive success. So again, how do all of these things connect? Their local foraging strategies, how does that help them reproduce well or not well? And how does their winter movements affect that as well? Getting into the telemetry, if you're unfamiliar with what telemetry is, we're talking about movements. So we actually affixed 48 breeding adults with a GPS transmitter. Silly of me, did not include a picture. But they're a small GPS backpack that actually would only be about 3% of the body mass of one of the skimmers. So most of them were males and large females. We did end up kind of doing like a 50-50 split. So females did end up being smaller, so we had to use larger females. So there were some that we couldn't put transmitters on. So again, the transmitters were put on these birds and caught with this noose net idea, which Dr. Goodenough put together because they kind of have large feet and large wings. You can't catch them in traditional ways in a cage like you would maybe a tern or an even oyster catcher you can catch in a small cage. But these noose net traps allowed us, pretty good success on capturing breeding adults. And the hardest part was obviously installing these. You could see these little loops. They're attached to a cage and kind of get put under the sand and staked down. These little slip knots get put in the ground. And once we leave, the skimmer obviously wants to come back and sit on his or her eggs. And they'll get tripped up by the noose. We'll run in there and let it free, and then bring that bird back for processing. So we were able to do this on all these birds over the course of a few years, and able to collect local and long-term migration and forage strategies through GPS. So I believe it's the next slide, so it's kind of fun. Okay, so this is 62,000 locations of 43 different skimmer across a couple of seasons. The map on your left, you can kind of see two different shades of red. The darker red is within 5 kilometers, or maybe it's 20 kilometers, sorry. I think that's 5. I think broadly it's 20 across, but within 5 kilometers is the dark red, and then beyond that is the lighter red. So you can see they're not moving far. Obviously, there's a lot of points. You could see the area hollowed out, kind of where Nickerson would be. That was just to show, kind of just remove those points from. But the point being is that they're using the whole bay. And they're using the bay pretty close, pretty far, kind of wide ranging all across Hempstead Bay, especially, but pretty concentrated to a relatively close area. They were not straying too far into Great South Bay, and you can see it's pretty rare that they actually went beyond Wantagh into the Great South Bay area. There were reports of them going as far as Shinnecock's and Mecox Bay. There were reports of them going up to the North Shore a few times, but very isolated, and majority of movements were pretty local. So with that, we were able to understand some key areas. With that, we were able to track individuals, Um, and just understand that the whole waterway is important to these birds, and they are trying to to nest close to their food source. And speaking of food source, I have a 1 minute video. Another part of our research was that we were actually putting out cameras to look for prey items and identify prey items. So this is a skimmer feeding its chick, what we believe is a killifish. And that was its first feeding. I think that camera was there most of the morning, and there were no chicks there early, or it was just hatching in the morning, and by the end of the day or later in the day, it was already being fed. So we had little GoPro cameras that we were able to put out on the beach and get some extra footage. And that also helped us look at some of the birds that we had already captured to make sure that they were returning to their nest. They weren't disturbed by the process that we put them through, and that the bands and the transmitter were actually still on them and staying on them, and then coinciding with, if we did need to return to that nest, God forbid the transmitter wasn't working, we might still be able to recapture that bird. So expanding on the diet side of what we were working on is Dr. Goodenough put together statistical analysis of the different prey items that staff and volunteers and interns did by doing focal provision surveys on black skimmer. So we had folks that would go watch the colony for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours at a time. Usually two people works best, one with binoculars or a scope, watching for adult skimmer with food, bringing it back to the colony, which it's easier to identify that than you think, because there's not a ton of, unless the whole colony gets flushed, there's a few birds coming in one at a time, two at a time. And when they're holding a big prey item in their mouth, even a small one, it's usually pretty obvious. It looks pretty different, especially once you're looking for it. So someone would identify a bird that's maybe bringing in fish back to the colony. You do your best to identify what fish that was. And Atlantic silverside, killifish, menhaden are some of the common ones, pipefish every now and again. Atlantic needlefish and sand eel are some of the best prey items for a young black skimmer. We tend to see that later in the season as they get larger, as that's a large prey item. Sometimes if they bring it back and the chick is too small, I can't even consume it. But those are signs of not only good fishery out there, there's diversity, but also bringing back larger items as the chicks get larger, show that the ecosystem is doing well out there, and that the chicks will likely do well. So this diet characterization says one thing. It confirmed our focal studies, first of all, that Atlantic silversides and killifish were being brought back most often, and that it coincides with a lot of the GPS data that we saw, that a lot of the movements were within Hempstead Bay. So these are estuarine prey items, not so much oceanic prey items, whereas terns will forage in the open ocean very often, whereas skimmer don't really do that. So that was one thing that was confirmed both through prey and GPS with skimmer especially. Um, Home ranges for skimmer is another sort of statistical analysis we were looking on at. A lot of times you can, since these birds share incubation and share chick rearing, sometimes there is a difference between male and female attendance. We did get some light through some analyses, did see that the males were there less often and had double the home range. But it was kind of variable and varied between years. But again, with the movement data that we have, we're able to kind of run these different analyses to see if there are trends and these sorts of analyses kind of just help with the life history understanding of these birds. I mean, again, we're getting into technology and new ways to look at these species, which are very different from the original text that come with what is a black skimmer. And a black skimmer weighs this much, and their wingspan is this amount. We were doing those same morphometrics with all these birds. So that data could help contribute to what is the species characteristic for a black skimmer, what is its size and weight. And us doing that, helps contribute to that as well. When we get into winter migration or offsite non-breeding migration, differences in sex, different in movement between spring and fall, and also locations. This was kind of fun because then it was an opportunity to actually look, where are these birds? We wouldn't get this data until they returned the following year, but it was really cool to see, well, how did they get here? We know they came probably from Florida or Georgia or the Carolinas, but to what degree we didn't really understand. And when did they leave and how often and how fast? So speed was another thing we were able to look at through the telemetry, and we were able to understand that the difference in speed or the difference in migration time between spring and fall. And one thing we found was the spring migration was much faster than the fall migration, which sort of makes sense. A lot of times in the spring, you're fighting the weather, you're fighting the hormones. If you're a black skimmer who needs to get to the colony to get to their site first, so they can get the best nesting spot. There's a lot of competition there, that's ingrained in their hormones and their genetics to get them back to their site. So, and then in the fall, weather is a factor to keep them up here. If you're around here in September, October into November, there's plenty of food here. There's plenty of fish, there's plenty of whales. So there's really no reason for the birds to leave their site until the food is an issue. So we've been seeing that at the site for over 10 years now, where they're starting to stay into October just because the weather and food source allows. So with that, the GPS confirmed a lot of this. Spring migration was much faster than fall migration. Rest times varied, and routes, which we'll get into, also vary. So one unique thing that we found is that there were almost um, two different strategies of returning south. So a lot of birds went straight to North Carolina and would stay there for a little while, and then eventually disperse all throughout Florida, even Cuba, which was pretty cool to find, which is something we didn't know until we had GPS on these birds. So we also had skimmer that were migrating from Nickerson, skipping the Carolinas and going to Georgia, and staying in Georgia much, much later, almost into December, before dispersing throughout Florida. So again, the GPS just confirmed when these things happened instead of relying on what we had in the past prior to starting this research, is relying on resites from the public. And I've met a lot of folks from Florida and Georgia, just through email, because they were seeing yellow-banded skimmer down in Florida or Georgia in the wintertime. And for a long time, we were compiling that kind of the old-fashioned way on pen and paper, and just kind of writing down each new place it was found. And it was fun to kind of go on Google Earth and look at a specific, wildlife preserve or beach or barrier island, where these birds were spending time in the winter, and trying to understand, well, what's going on there. And then finally meeting the people that might be either volunteering at the site or even managing it, and understand, well, what's going on there, for good reasons or for good or bad. And there were areas of Florida that had, massive red tide issues that were affecting skimmer in the winter. There were areas that were highly recreated. As we know, everyone goes to Florida in the winter. So it was actually a good sign to see them dispersing well throughout Florida, knowing that, well, if there is issues throughout the overwintering season, they're able to, move around. And the same goes for the spring migration, whereas they kind of, work their way back up the coastline in a couple of varying ways. Again, some of the ones that stayed in Georgia or in North Florida kind of stayed there most of the season and kind of made a beeline later than others right up the coast to the Chesapeake or Delaware Bay, whereas others from Florida might have went to Florida, up to North Carolina, and worked their way up eventually. And what we also saw was Delaware Bay being an important stopover location, because we found them, skimmer actually coming to the Nickerson colony. Maybe it was in late April, early May, etc. And then maybe the weather turned for a week or so and they left. And no one set up shop, no one had done anything so far. It was more just they're here to check it out, but they're not really here settled down yet. And they were going back to Delaware Bay and into South Jersey and into areas that are fairly close to us, but also obviously very important to these birds that nest right here in New York. Just another way to show it. This is just two specific individuals instead of a whole bunch of points laid over each other. CO8, we actually got a couple of years of data from, so you can see the tracks kind of repeat over itself, which is just showing even their migration fidelity is pretty strong. So these birds are really hugging the coast. They are not going offshore. They are not cutting many corners. They are really hugging the coastline across their migration. The CO8, of course, was one of the two birds that we banned that actually went to Cuba, explored some of these areas that we would all love to go to someday, I'm sure. And C12 was more your normal one going to the east or west coast of Florida, spending a lot of their time in one spot throughout the winter. Whereas you see CO8 kind of went everywhere, went to the Keys, went to Miami, went to Cuba, must have had a few dollars to spend. Repeat migrations, like I said, C13, another example where they kind of really took a very similar trip. But again, Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, North Carolina, these important estuaries and stopover locations, further reiterate how important the entire flyway is for not just skimmer, but, all of these different nesting species that nest here in New York. Um, And one last thing that I want to mention on our research that is kind of unique, and again, just goes to the power of the technology where we could actually test a few different theories and run different statistics on things. This is fly forage behavior, which was really wouldn't have been shown otherwise without GPS data that's taking very fine scale measurements. So these GPS trackers were collecting anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes per point. Eventually, some were over the course of just a few per day to save battery, but many of them their first year were collecting a point once per hour. So these graphics show a bird kind of, coming through the area and staying for a very short time and then continuing on. So they're not like other shorebirds that need to fatten up before they go because they make a really long journey and don't have many stopovers. They stop over pretty much as they go. They forage as they go all throughout. They follow the food back to and fro. So that kind of adds into and makes sense as to, some of the data we saw before, whereas they're just moving and meandering down the coast as the food allows them, so they can get back to either their wintering ground or the nesting areas. Um, there's plenty more to talk about this research, and I skimmed through some of it just because some of it's a little jargony with as a lot of it is preliminary. But what's really important to me moving forward, since we're not actively tracking many skimmer at this point, most of the GPS that we have put on them over the years have reached the end of their lives. We've actually removed many transmitters, so that's usually a question is what happens to this transmitter? It just stays on this poor bird for the rest of its life? Well, not necessarily, because we've collected about almost a dozen of them to date by recollecting that adult by capturing it a second time and actually removing that dead transmitter. And some of those dead transmitters we've actually had refurbished for a fraction of the cost to actually put on another bird to, continue the research, without the funding at this point. So really what we're looking for at this point is how others can help us with this research moving forward and how others can contribute to our data set. And really at this point, it's submitting band recites about skimmer that we see here at the colony. Not so much every day, but per season for sure, and during the nesting season for sure. And photographs of prey items either being fed like you saw in the video I showed, or even just adults flying over with food sources that are identifiable, that again adds to our data set, which at this point can continue to be added to through citizen science. And if you've been to the Nickerson colony, we have some signage out there with this information so that folks can contribute in the way that they desire, because there are a lot of folks out there that are there for the birds. Not everyone's there to just have a good time on the beach. Some are there to photograph the birds or just enjoy them. So if they can contribute to this research that, we talk about, that's great. And I encourage you all to speak to the folks that are working out there at the colony, because they're a wealth of knowledge and they want to help and they want people who see things to let them know what they saw because they're out there a few hours a day and they only see what they see. So, and of course, be a steward for the colony. You're not the only ones. We're not the only ones that are there to enforce things, but gently remind folks that are breaking the rules that this habitat is for everyone to share. So, I left some phone numbers for folks if you ever need to get in touch with the Bay Constables or the DC ECOs for something. Of course, that's really serious. I would reach out to them if you're out on the beach and can't find one of us or someone else that could help. One last thing, Linda mentioned that I am the director of Friends of Hempstead Plains, which is true. Russ and others at South Shore Audubon participated in a few walks this past year over at the Hempstead Plains and Purcell Preserve. So just a plug for Hempstead Plains and a plug for what Russ and you guys have been working on, commenting on the DEIS and whether you're an individual citizen who lives in the area, whether you like to gamble, like the environment or not. It's just important as a public citizen, as a citizen here of Nassau County, to understand development that is happening in our county and how it may affect us in the future, for good or bad. So I do encourage folks to maybe skim through it. It's rather lengthy, but at least educate themselves on the project and whether you like it, don't like it, or are in between. I encourage you to leave comments to Nassau County on this DEI, and especially if you are of the ilk of a researcher or someone who has some of the knowledge of the things that Russ and others have been working on, because local knowledge and is really important, I think, in this project, and I hope that those voices are heard throughout the process. So whether this development happens in the future, there is, record of people that care. And that's what matters at the end for a good project. And wherever it goes, it goes. But I encourage folks to comment if they choose to. Um, Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing in a moment. We have some time. I have about 10 minutes left. If anyone has questions, comments, I can go back to other slides. We can open a dialogue. We can talk as long as you'd like. So thank you all very much. And I do this anytime. And happy holidays to you all.
Okay, happy holidays to you, Rob. Um, People are welcome to unmute yourselves now and ask questions. I'd like to start off with a question. How many prey items can a skimmer bring back to the nest in one trip?
Be one per trip, but it's pretty constant. It
Yeah,
it is difficult to obviously identify a certain pair and wait for multiple provisions. So it's really hard to understand, well, how often is this happening? You can with the GPS telemetry, we're able to understand how many trips, how much energy they're expending. But are you saying it's tough then to say, is it coming back for the prey item? Is it eating it himself? Is it giving it to a chick? So, some of that is theoretical and understanding. So trips and how much energy are they expending is really one thing that we're able to understand better.
okay. And the male and the female just alternate going on trips, or
They will. And we saw that in some of the data. Like I said, some of the male will go further sometimes. Maybe that had to do with the female, one of them sitting on eggs, so they had the time to go because it wasn't shared equally, which was also something that we found kind of anecdotally, just over the years trying to catch them. And a lot of times we had to catch the female because they weighed less. So they were harder to find the ones of weight to actually put a band on. So a lot of times we would catch the male and then we'd have to let the male go. I really want the female. And then the female would never come, never come, never come. And maybe she's out feeding and the male would always be at the nest. So anecdotally, they don't share at 50-50 at least.
okay, thank you. So, couple in the chat, Paul has asked if you could go back to the slide of the nesting pair. Am I read of the nesting pairs?
Sure, yeah.
I think it's the chart. Am I reading it correctly? that Nickerson has 550 nesting pairs.
We do.
Mm, nice. Now,
Um,
was that the male and female, the size difference you just went past?
yes, that's actually a great photo. Where'd it go?
It's a pretty big difference. Hmm.
Yeah, so you can see the male on the right and the female on the left, and the chick obviously beneath them. Let's go back. So yeah, so the colony in Nickerson has been going up pretty substantially the last 5 years. You can see in 2018 we were under 300 pair. Um, through 21 we were almost up to 400, and now we're over 500. It does include 2024, which is actually increasing again. It was roughly the same. It was about 575 pair, I'd say, this year. Commingling of Nickerson and Breezy Point skimmers, absolutely. They're all commingling. We saw that in the local data as well. Um, we had banded birds that were visiting the Arvern colony, visiting the Breezy colony. There's also some years a colony at Silver Point, which is on the west end of Long Beach Island, where on the east end of the island, the Breezy Point colony has been doing very well the last 2 years. I know they were very productive, and very productive with zero protection, mind you. Someone in here mentioned that they live in Breezy. If you live in the co-op, you know that there's no string fence, there's no signage, there's no really anything going on there, and those birds just nest out on the beach and just hope and pray that they make it. Um, and they've done really well. So with that means that there are a lot of colonies locally that are, commingling and shifting, meaning that, if something bad does happen early enough in the season, these birds we've seen move from, say, the Arvern colony to the Breezy colony because something gets flooded out or bad weather or predation or vandalism. You mention it. That allows, some flexibility, but overall the number of colonies has declined, over the decades, which is the issue.
Okay,
Uh,
a couple of other things, and you can look at the chat too if you like. But iPad says Breezy had 550 adults this summer, not pairs, but adults. And Paul, who asked the question, said that's amazing that there's 550 at Nickerson. He lives in Breezy, and he guesses there's maybe 100 to 150 breeding pairs, which he thought was a lot um, compared
oh,
to
I see what you did here.
Nickerson 50. Now, another person asks, Paul, another person asks, and it's iPad again, if there's commingling of the Nickerson and Breezy Point skimmers from those two colonies.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I see the chat now. So yeah, we mentioned that. Do you collect data on deceased skimmers that you may come across during field observation? Bet. Um, we do collect carcasses here and there, usually ones that are out of the ordinary. Ones that we have to collect are if obviously there's a take on the beach, which means that, something either ran it over or stepped on it, which is obviously extremely rare. But that triggers a whole different thing of sighting data collection and such. But routinely, we're not necessarily collecting things unless we have to, but we do have a way to do that. Um, we have actually one thing I didn't mention tonight, which I guess sort of related to the deceased, but we've been looking at fecal samples through another group, the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative was helping run that. We're working with them on a program called Project Poop across the entire flyway, where folks are collecting fecal samples from skimmers and terns to look at genetics and diet and all sorts of DNA. So we participated in that this summer instead, since we're not doing transmitters anymore. We started to collect fecal samples when we banded chicks. So that was, again, another way to add to the data set and add to what other collaborators are working on across the flyway, since, these habitats are connected to each other. What other states have significant colonies? New Jersey has a lot of black skimmer, Cape May, all across the shore. Really, the whole Atlantic Flyway has skimmer colonies, with the exception of like kind of like the mid-Atlantic, like Virginia. They have them just in much smaller numbers. There's a lot in Florida. There's a lot in Georgia. There's a lot in Texas, across the Gulf Coast. Again, we were talking about subspecies, so some of them don't commingle with the Atlantic species. So the ones that nest in Texas and Louisiana do not commingle with the birds in Florida who end up in New York. So very interesting that the New York birds do not commingle with them. Um, and then, of course, the ones on the West Coast and Central America are so far away that they rarely commingle as well. Uh, any theories on why the numbers of breeding sites drop so dramatically? Likely disturbance, likely development. Some of that research was by Joanna Berger and Ruth Gotchfeld many years ago. And many things have changed since then, mostly development and disturbance. What percentage of offspring survive to adulthood? I would say, don't quote me on this, but they're not a high productivity species similar to oyster catcher. But I'd say they're higher than that, probably around like a one, like one. They only lay about three eggs, sometimes four. If one or two survive, that's pretty good. Um, I think this year we had a pretty high productivity. Like I mentioned, we had about 550 pairs. We averaged during the liquid survey 1150. We banded 65 juveniles or chicks, varying ages. Um, but they must have fledged 4 to 600 birds this year. I would say close to one productivity, which is really good. Were skimmers not known to frequent Cuba before our findings? I think it's just a matter of there's not a lot of research going on down there, not a lot of collaboration down there. I think it's known that there's the possibility, but they're not really a tropical species either. So, at some point, there's a line in the sand or they just have no need. Like I said, they don't travel very far offshore. So maybe that 90 miles to Cuba is as far as they really need to go. So really unknown. It was just kind of cool findings for sure. Um, Paraguay saw skimmers in inland waters. Do you know where these skimmers may have migrated from if they migrated at all? So Dr. Goodenough, when we first found her, our first meeting with her, she was in the jungle in the Amazon studying skimmer. And so skimmer work the inland of Central America. They work the inland of parts of Mexico. There's breeding on, I believe, both sides, and in inland areas, absolutely. Uh, Morphometrically, they're incredibly different. They're substantially larger. They nest in smaller groups. They nest right on the edge of the Amazon River, which is just like amazing. And they don't interact, so they're almost like a completely different bird. Average lifespan of a skimmer. Most shorebirds are pretty long-lived. I would say a skimmer, it's definitely in the 15 plus year range, like most shorebirds. I can't say for sure through our data. I do know that we've been, at the town, at least, the yellow bands that we've been using have been using for, oh, I want to say since 2011. So that's at least 13 years. And we still find bands that we did the first couple of years. So, there's certainly birds that are well over 10 years old at this point. There we go. Someone answered 40 years. I believe it. Like I've seen skimmers and terns and oyster catchers that are well over 20 years old, through banding, through resites, through this sorts of citizen science, which again contributes to, the actual data and the life history that we all know about these birds. When we go and look up a bird on the internet, you're basing it off of knowledge that was understood a long time ago. And how often is a lot of that updated? And I think that's an important part of some of this too, as we add to technology and better understanding and this adaptive management sort of thinking, in terms of conservation. There are other studies done with other colonies with the telemetry, not here in New York. Specifically, they are putting them on oyster catcher in Jersey. Um, Dr. Goodenough has been working with Skimmer in, like I mentioned, in the Amazon, but also on the West Coast. She's been working on royal terns and oyster catchers in North Carolina, all across the Atlantic Flyway. So, part of this research and one of the overarching conservation goals and research goals of this project was to get this information and this knowledge out there so that others can see it and say this is a good tool to understand our population of skimmer or our population of oyster catcher, showing that this technology and these protocols, like a lot of which Kate Goodenough put together, not only the way we catch the bird, how we affix the transmitter, how we could then process GPS data afterwards to actually find trends that align with what we're looking at. And one thing that I did not mention enough, or really at all, when I showed Hempstead Bay and wanted to connect with where they were feeding, the water quality is something that we all can connect with, I think. If the water quality is poor, we can't fish in it. We can't pick up the shellfish. We can't swim in it. We can't recreate in it. So water quality of our local waterways are obviously of the utmost importance to the public. And the skimmer have been a very strong indicator of that, considering they're using an extensive portion of Hempstead Bay, which allows us to connect water quality with common feeding areas and combine that with productivity results, which then show just either reiterate the fact that water quality is important or show that poor water quality could, affect productivity, which again is just a sign or a marker of something's wrong. There's imbalance in our ecosystem, which indirectly and eventually directly affects us as humans, whether it's financially, whether it's health wise, whatever makes the public stir, these birds are the first ones that understand it. So, it's our job as conservationists and researchers and naturalists and regular citizens is to, promote research and promote this sort of kind of unique approach to conservation and management so that we can understand kind of these big picture problems that actually affect our lives. Some can say that what's the point? You're running around looking at birds, whatever. This is why it matters, and this is how you connect it to real world problems and find real world solutions to them through scientific research. Is circling, reskimming the same patch of water a common feeding behavior? Yes and no. It goes back to kind of that that fly behavior, fly forage behavior. They're kind of just constantly moving. So you'll see them forage in small groups out in the bay, and they'll just kind of be working around through the channels in the marsh, and they'll just take a skim and keep going. They won't really circle around. They'll just kind of just keep moving wherever. So they follow the food. They just kind of skim where the water's calm. I think that works the best for them. They feed by touch. So as soon as something touched, that jaw snaps closed, and they're really good night flyers and they're extremely agile flyers. So you'll see them fly between the bridges at night, right between docks to try to, get what they're looking for, which is that calm water where you have, fish on the surface. Most of their foraging is that was one of the theories we were looking into was, nocturnal feeding and we felt that they were doing a majority of their feeding at night, which was not totally clear in the data. Through our provision surveys, obviously we're doing them during the day while we're there at work during light hours. You can't really do it at night. So it was tough to get data on the night end, but we found a significant amount of provisions. We've gotten thousands over the years. So there is a lot that's going on during the day, but the overall thought is yes, they are doing a lot of night feeding, and their eye structure, definitely speaks to that. They can see in low light very well. So definitely not the heat of the day, but early morning, late in the day, I can't really speak to middle of the night sort of.
Here, let me.
Um, Someone asked about conservation efforts, Alley Pond Park, teach environmental study K through 12. You're going to teach materials about skimmer. Would love to utilize them. I would reach out to Audubon, New York, Audubon, New York, Connecticut. They do the Share the Shore program. They have a lot of outreach materials specific to shorebirds and shorebird nesting. They've done they'll do class things. They'll come to there. We've had classes work with us on the beach where they create signs that can go out on the in the colonies and to keep away from the colony, and it has a little nice color flair from the kids. So those that's definitely an option. Um, and then also, I think someone asked about the Hempstead Plains as well. I'll let Russ talk about that, but
Yes, in the coming weeks, we're going to have a video presentation all about that.
okay,
So
very good.
let everyone know, sign up for our email list. It's at the bottom of our homepage. Just put in your email. You can unsubscribe anytime you want to, and then then we'll let you know when we're going to have that presentation, and it'll be a good one.
Yeah, I mean, we have maybe 5 more minutes if anyone has any more questions or issues, and if you want me to pull anything back up.
Um,
Why do the skimmers catch fish for the chicks, go back to the nest instead of feeding the chick, then fly back to the ocean? Well, uh, the chicks themselves can't feed themselves. They're not going to leave the colony. Um, and the adults aren't necessarily catching the fish right out in front of them. They might travel 5 miles for that fish, and they might be gone for a half hour for that. Um, I would assume it varies greatly as to the frequency of that feeding, which was another question before. It's kind of related, um, they it really depends on the time of day. It depends on the size of the chick. It depends on the last prey item they fed it. It also depends on the number of chicks they have. When they have 3 chicks and they just hatch, they're constantly foraging. And there's constantly only one adult there, and one comes back, the other one leaves, and it's constant until then. Once they have maybe only one chick and the chick is larger, they're feeding much less often.
Say, Rob, Linda had a question, and she's asking about the size of the transmitter and how do you attach it to the skimmer?
Sure. So the transmitter itself is pretty small, smaller than my charge block, I would say. Maybe about this size, maybe half the thickness, I'd say, of that. Um, so it's pretty small. It has a little solar panel on it, a small antenna. Um, it it connects to a leg loop harness. So it's kind of 2 loops that get attached to it, and it goes kind of like under the legs and around the wings, so it can't fall off. Um, and then it's just kind of on there. There's extra padding, and it sits on its back, and you kind of don't notice it. And then eventually it either falls off or it gets taken off or it stops working. They migrate singly or in flocks. They leave in groups, small groups. Some will leave earlier than others, depending on if they had young that failed. Maybe they were birds that failed early. They might leave earlier. Sometimes there's asynchronous nesting that goes on at the colony, and birds will, there'll be a wave that are done by mid-August, and then a wave that really isn't done till mid-September. So some may leave earlier than others. Do they mate for life? Yes and no. They're pretty strong fidelity. They pretty have pretty strong fidelity to their mates as well. A little tougher to confirm that with a colony nester, but it's certainly confirmed in, say, oyster catcher and plover. We get a lot of that, so it's pretty common, but there's definitely more mixing with the colony species. A lot more can happen to an individual. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone for their time tonight. And if anyone has more questions in the future, I left my email at the end of the presentation tonight. But Russ, feel free to pass around my Gmail to anyone who has more questions or in a newsletter anytime. And hope everyone has an awesome holiday. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year. And we'll see you all on the beach next spring. We're at the Hempstead Plains. I'm there on Saturdays, spring and summer and fall.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Okay, bye.